Hello, good evening. Welcome to Tuesday Night Live. And thank you so much for joining me. I was just watching that intro and thinking my favorite part of the intro is when there's four Rob Buckinghams. And I thought, the foray into omnipresence and how amazing that could be when you could be in more than one place at once, like you could be at work and also walking on the beach and also sleeping. And just funny things that cross your mind. Anyway, thank you for joining me either live or during the week in catch up. And if you are joining me live, you'll know that, and especially if you're from Melbourne, you'll know that we are experiencing weather that really belongs in Queensland. And we really wish it had stayed north of the border, but it is pretty hot and humid and thunderstorms all over the place. And I'm here once again, the barefoot theologian, in my Fleetwood Mac t-shirt, I hasten to add to. If Gigi, my eldest daughter, is watching, we got this at the Fleetwood Mac concert back in 2019. And she bought me and her tickets for my birthday, and we went along and enjoyed Fleetwood Mac together. It was one of the most enjoyable evenings ever as these 70-somethings all came out on stage, no support act, and they just got right into it. And they started at 8 and they finished just before 11 o'clock with no break. And they were absolutely amazing. Anyway, I'm not here to talk about Fleetwood Mac, as wonderful as they are. I'm here to talk with you about anything you'd like to chat about, plus some questions that I've been sent over the last couple of weeks that I hope that we get into at some point in time. And so, I've just had a long weekend off as well, which has been wonderful. Many of you, if you're watching on Facebook, you will have picked up that it was my birthday last Saturday, and just had a lovely birthday with family and some friends. And I do appreciate us having a long weekend. I'm sure it wasn't just for my birthday. Do stop by and say good day if you're watching on any of the Facebook platforms or YouTube or LinkedIn. Then whatever you put in the chat feed will pop up in the StreamYard studio here. So you can say good day, let me know where you're watching from. And also, if you've got any questions and comments as we go through, feel free to interact, and I'll acknowledge you as we go. So good day to Nika, good day to Kathy and to Halla, good day to Matt, hi Terence, good day Diane. I'm going to be answering your question in just a moment. And also Selena, who says hi from Yoshi, my parrot, and myself. So a special shout out to Yoshi the parrot. And Ross says g'day, and also Zizi as well. Lovely to have you all joining me, and I'm sure there'll be others who pop in through the evening as well. So quick recap of what we looked at last week. There were lots of questions about prophets and prophecy, which were kind of left over from the week before. So I finished that up last week. The questions that we looked at last week: should a prophet or anyone say the words, "The Lord has told me"? What about prophetic voices speaking out on current issues? Why are so many Christians who are anti-vax, anti-lockdown, anti-government lapping up this kind of prophetic ministry? What are your thoughts on the reliability of prophetic words? And so we touched on all of that last week. If you missed that, you can revisit that. Also, what did Jesus mean by binding the strong man? And is that something Christians are still to do today? And then I answered a couple of questions about Lent and Ash Wednesday and Shrove Tuesday, and are they in the Bible? So that's the recap. This week, we'll see how we go. After the flood, did God create more people, or did Noah's family reproduce amongst themselves? I think there's a word for that, isn't there? And also, when Jesus told Pontius Pilate, "You would have no power over me if it weren't given you from above," is he saying that God chooses people to be put in power or powerful leadership positions? And then asks the question, people like Vladimir Putin, of course, which is very topical. And there is one other question. And as I was preparing these, I thought, I really, really doubt that we'll get to the last question, but we'll just see how we go. But first, Di asks, can you talk about Cain and Abel? She says, I've been confused as to why God accepted Abel's sacrifice, but not Cain's. I'd like to recommend that you go back and listen to podcast number 11, which was on understanding Genesis, which is a really important teaching. I did that with a lot of help from my rabbi friend Tal, of course, who's a Hebrew scholar. And if you want to ask about the Hebrew scriptures, he's a really, really good one to chat with. And so I often do a Zoom with Tal and ask him some great questions, and he always gives me some wonderful answers. So I really encourage you to revisit podcast number 11 on understanding Genesis. But to summarize that, Jews look at the time pre-Abraham, or Abram, as he was originally known. That time they consider to be allegorical or metaphorical stories. So that's Genesis chapters 1 to 11. They're not viewed as history. They're used as metaphor, which is stories with a meaning. Happy to use the word parable there as well. From Genesis chapter 12 onwards is history. And so the best way of kind of getting our heads around understanding these first 11 chapters of Genesis is that they're stories from the ancient world. They are literally prehistoric stories. They're 2.5, 3,000, 4,000 years old. Who actually really knows how old these stories were? They were told by ancient tribes. Their number one form of entertainment at night, as they were relaxing around the campfire, would be to recount and retell stories. And these stories were told and retold and told again and told by other people. And you can imagine what happens over the process of time. It was oral tradition. So nothing was written down for thousands of years. And then eventually, once writing came into vogue, there was a good idea. The priests said, and many of the scholars said, let's start writing these things down. And some of those stories we have in our Bibles. Of course, some of them didn't make it into the Bible for whatever reason. And so Genesis chapter 1 to 11, I find it really, really useful to look at it in that way. And so with any of these stories, you got to read the story in totality and then see what jumps out to you as what we'd refer to as the primary or defining moment. To put it in modern language, what is your OMG moment when you're reading the story? And that's what we'll be asking ourselves in a moment about the story of Cain and Abel. The wonder of the sacred text is that you can dwell with a story at various times and come away with something completely different every time, depending on where you're at. And so you might read the story of Cain and Abel at one time, and your OMG moment would be one particular aspect of the story. You could read it weeks, months, or years later, and then something else jumps out to you. And I love that about the Bible. The Bible says of itself that it is living and active. And so whenever we revisit, we'll often see something new, something different, something fresh, and most importantly, something appropriate, something that really, really hits home to us. And so with that background in mind, let me read to you Genesis chapter 4, verses 1 to 16. This is the story of Cain and Abel. And I want you to notice, particularly in the early part of the story, how bloomin' fast this goes. It moves really, really quickly. Look at this. Adam made love to his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. I mean, that's almost a year gone right there in half the first verse. She said, with the help of the Lord, I have brought forth a man. So the word Cain actually means brought forth. Verse 2, later she gave birth to his brother Abel. We don't know how much longer that was, probably years. Now, Abel kept flocks. Oh my goodness. They've done school, they've graduated, and now they're working full time. So what are they now? Well into their teens, maybe even into their 20s. So Abel kept flocks. Cain worked the soil. In the course of time, we don't know how long that is, Cain brought some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord, and Abel also brought an offering, fat portions from some of his firstborn, some of the firstborn of his flock. The Lord looked with favor on Abel and his offering, but on Cain and his offering, he did not look with favor. So Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. We'll come back to that because that's an important moment in the story. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." Now Cain said to his brother Abel, "Let's go out to the field." While they were in the field, Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. Then the Lord said to Cain, "Where is your brother Abel?" "I don't know," he replied, "my brother's keeper." The Lord said, "What have you done?" "Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground. Now you are under a curse and driven from the ground, which opened its mouth to receive your brother's blood from your hand." You pick up all the metaphorical language here. When you work the ground, it will no longer yield its crops for you. You will be a restless wanderer on earth. Cain said to the Lord, "My punishment is more than I can bear. Today you are driving me from the land, and I will be hidden from your presence. I will be a restless wanderer on the earth, and whoever finds me will kill me." But the Lord said to him, "Not so," or "Very well." He was convincing to God. "Anyone who kills Cain will suffer vengeance 7 times over." Then the Lord put a mark on Cain. We're not told what that is, so that no one who found him would kill him. So Cain went out from the Lord's presence and lived in the land of Nod, east of Eden. I love that name, the the land of Nod. Sounds like where everyone sleeps. The word Nod there, the Hebrew word, means wandering. And so Cain, part of Cain's curse was that he would be a wanderer. He acknowledges that he'll be a wanderer, and then he goes and lives in a place called Wandering. So the question, lots of questions I'm going to ask you, and I want you to ponder these things during the week as well. What jumps out to you or at you from this story? And you might even want to read it again in your own time. What jumps out at you? What is your OMG moment as you read about Cain and Abel? What is the defining moment in the story for me? That's the question that I want you to ask yourself. For me personally, the defining moment is Cain killing Abel. That's a defining moment. And so when you find that defining moment in a biblical story, you've got that, and then you work backwards and you ask questions. How did that happen in the story? You might want to do a little bit of a Sherlock and Holmes, a bit of detective work. Was there a motive? Where was the body? Why and in what way did this killing happen? Is it clear that it was a murder? What else happened in the story? Did Cain and Abel have words with each other? Were they angry with one another? If so, what did they say? What was spoken? What led up to Cain attacking Abel? Did Abel provoke him? Or was it self-defense? Was it manslaughter? Was it premeditated murder? We're actually not told any of this in the story. So by asking these questions, you could dig deep into the story and just imagine and flesh it out. What happened to Abel's body? Did Cain bury it? The story doesn't tell us. What God says is that the earth opened its mouth and swallowed Abel's blood. It's a metaphorical story, right? We don't know from the story what transpired in the field other than the very simple statement that the Bible says here: Cain attacked his brother Abel and killed him. That's all we know. Of course, the worst violent crimes are always committed by people who are close to one another, and we see this, of course, on the news regularly and sadly. So back to the question, why did God accept Abel's sacrifice and not Cain's? That's the question. And I want you to notice here that the word sacrifice is actually not used in the story. And it's an interesting thing, isn't it? And I've always viewed it as a sacrifice. Cain's sacrifice was not accepted. Abel's sacrifice is. And it's probably because we're coming at it from a position of of future versus history. So we've read the whole Bible and we've seen how important sacrifice was under the old covenant, the sacrifice of animals, and how Jesus was the once and for all sacrifice, once and for all people, once and for all time. And so, as followers of Jesus, sacrifice is something that's actually quite uppermost in our minds. But this is before sacrifice. And the word sacrifice is not used in the story, but the word offering is used. And so, why was God unhappy with Cain's offering, but happy with Abel's? And so, as I say, this story is well before the law and the sacrificial system. So, why did God like Abel's sacrifice of portions of an animal, and he didn't like Cain's sacrifice of the fruit of the ground? Does God prefer meat to veggies? Is he a carnivore versus a herbivore? Of course not. The fact is that Cain was a farmer and he tended the ground and grew crops. Abel was a shepherd. He kept flocks. And so it made sense that farmer Cain would bring some of the fruits of the soil as an offering to the Lord. It equally made sense that shepherd Abel also brought an offering, in this case, fat portions from some of the firstborn of his flock. Both men gave an offering of what they had. And the Hebrew scriptures, the Tanakh, does not condemn agricultural offerings. I've heard some people teach on this and say, Abel brought a blood offering and Cain just brought some fruit and veggies. And so God wanted an animal, he wanted blood. But this is well before the sacrificial system. This is not even in their line of thinking at this time. And so all the way through the Hebrew scriptures, the people were bringing offerings and tithes to the Lord, and invariably it was an offering from their crops. So when they brought the tithe to the temple, it would be 10% of their crop, whatever that was. Was it wheat? Was it fruit? Whatever. They would bring it and they would leave it at the temple, and that was for the priests to use. And money was given as well, of course, and that would have gone for the running of the temple. The same under the new covenant. The tithes and the offerings are brought predominantly to make sure that those who teach the word and those who lead well in a church community are remunerated for their work. Paul talks about that in 1 Corinthians chapter 9. So God's not against agricultural offerings, and that's not the deal in the story. I'd ask a few more questions here. Who taught them to give offerings? Was it their parents? There's no mention in the Bible at this stage of teaching on offerings, either in this story or before. Although God killed an animal to make clothes for Adam and Eve to cover their nakedness, there's no inference in this story or before it that God accepted or required an animal offering. Cain's offering is the first recorded offering in the Bible. So that's the first mention. And so should that not tell us something about this offering? So why did God accept Abel's sacrifice and not Cain? Why indeed did God put Abel's offering on a higher level than Cain's? Remember, this is a campfire story. It's a metaphor. It's a parable, and it's meant to teach something. It would have taught something originally, and then it would have been retold and probably changed a little bit over the process of time to fit different cultures and situations that people were facing. So they're sitting around the campfire and they're telling a story, and I wonder what question prompted the story. I wonder, could it have been a little child or even maybe a teenager asking their parents, why is there evil in the world? Or maybe it was more direct or more blunt. Why do people kill each other? It was an ancient dilemma that people still grapple with today. If there's a loving God, why is there suffering? Why is there evil in the world? And so to answer questions like that, the ancients would create stories in order to explore possibilities. So the story of Cain and Abel here could explore some of the reasons for pain and suffering in the world. Remember, the Bible is a book of questions, not just a book of answers. My rabbi friend said to me today, if you read a story that doesn't bring up more questions than answers, you're probably not reading the Bible properly. He said the sacred texts are verbs, not end points. And I think there's so much wisdom and gold that we can mine from that statement or those statements. I just love it. So, how do the principal actors react in the story? The question here is, what is Cain's reaction to Abel's offering being taken above his? The Bible tells us, so Cain was very angry and his face was downcast. We would say their face fell. It's an evocative and profound description. Uh, do this and it changes your mood and it changes the way you look. If my face fell, my face falls, I'm downcast, I'm sad. It's actually very hard to do that and not feel it in your spirit. When you do that, it's like, oh, I'm downcast, and you can feel your spirit sag under the weight of your fallen face. So it affects your mood and it affects the way you look. If you got children, especially young children, you know the times when they come and ask you for something, and for whatever reason, the answer that you give them is no. What happens? Well, they become downcast, their face falls. And at that time, you have to try and help them deal with the sense of disappointment that they're feeling. And that's a very important point when it comes to this story. Cain, in this story, is shattered by rejection. The Lord said to Cain, "Why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at your door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it." So what God is saying here to Cain, let me paraphrase this. What God is saying to Cain is this: how you're feeling is normal. But if you nurture this resentment and envy in your heart, it will be like a crouching tiger at the entrance to your cave. What a magnificent picture comes into our minds as we read these scriptures. God hadn't turned his back on Cain. In fact, God was giving Cain an opportunity to learn from disappointment and rejection, something he would experience in life again and again, just like all of us. I want you to think for a moment the times that you face disappointment in your life. Maybe you're feeling a time of disappointment at the moment. What about rejection? It's horrible being rejected, isn't it? And of course, when we experience these things, yes, it shows on our face. We become downcast, our face falls, and we deal with various emotions on the inside of us that we need to learn to deal with in a healthy way. And I'll mention some of those things to you in a moment. But in our story, instead of learning from the moment, Cain's ego is bruised and his face fell. God didn't invalidate Cain's feelings, but Cain doesn't heed God's voice and has a confrontation with Abel instead. That confrontation leads to death. The crouching tiger had not been tamed, and so it had destroyed. And so there's this dialogue here between God and Cain. God says, "Where's your brother?" Cain lies. He says, "I don't know," and then makes an excuse. "Am I my brother's keeper?" Interesting expression in the Hebrew. It suggests with the word keeper something like, what? Do I stay awake all night so I can keep an eye on him? It's a cheeky question. It's fairly heavy with sarcasm. Basically, Cain's asking God, am I responsible for him? And if so, where does that responsibility begin and end? It's actually a really good question. It's a question that every one of us should be able to ask and answer in any given situation. You see, all of us are responsible for others to a point. But the point ends at the point where that responsibility becomes detrimental to you personally. And so if it does become harmful, you need to look for a way to extricate yourself from that responsibility, if at all possible. An example that springs to mind here is a woman, particularly who may be in an abusive marriage or relationship. So there's a responsibility that she has as a wife to her husband, but the husband, by his acts of abuse, be they verbal, emotional, or physical, um, is basically drawing the line. And the wife says, "Okay, my responsibility ends here for you, and I need to extricate myself from this situation to look after myself." That's what I believe the story is teaching us here. God then says to Cain, "What have you done?" And then he says something interesting. "Listen, your brother's blood cries out to me from the ground." Again, this is a allegorical, metaphorical story. Blood doesn't speak, but in this metaphorical story, blood speaks. So what was it crying out? Uh, it was crying out for vengeance. It was crying out for retribution. It was crying out for anger. Maybe it was crying out for death. This story is picked up, or this part of the story is picked up again in the New Testament in Hebrews 12:24. Jesus, the mediator of a new covenant, whose shed blood on the cross speaks a better word than the blood of Abel. I love that. You see, Abel's blood, according to this story, would have been crying out things that were fairly negative: anger, unrighteousness, vengeance, death. Jesus' blood speaks a better thing, speaks a better word. Jesus' blood on the cross speaks for forgiveness, speaks about justice, speaks about life. Isn't that just absolutely wonderful? And so Cain complains. He says, "My punishment is more than I can bear." And so, in response to the complaint, God then sets boundaries on Cain's punishment. The story ends with Cain settling in the land of Nod, east of Eden. He gets married and starts a family. And I don't know, maybe he lives happily ever after. Who knows? For me, one of the key takeaways from this story is this: if we lose perspective, something that is temporary can become permanent. Because the story isn't about offerings and God accepting this and not accepting that. The story is about maintaining perspective even when something horrible has happened to us and we're experiencing all these emotions churning away on the inside. All of us have had and will have defining moments in our lives. A defining moment, particularly negative. Um, Cain's defining moment was the rejection of his offering. He was downcast, he was envious, he was angry, but he didn't process it. And so he acted out on his emotions. I wonder what would have been a better way of processing his emotions, and what we in 2022 can learn from this ancient story. When something negative happens to me, be it rejection or whatever the case might be, I give myself permission to reflect on my feelings for a while. Like Cain should have done. He was downcast, he was envious, he was angry, and maybe rightly so. Maybe there was a lack of justice in this story towards him. How do we feel when something unjust has happened to us? We need to acknowledge those emotions. We need to acknowledge those feelings. We need to be able to say something like this: I am a flawed human being, and there are some things that I can't handle right now, so I will wait. And there's the wisdom. You see, meltdowns are inevitable, so we need to learn to be good at them. We've all had those. So let me give you an example, a really practical example. You didn't get that promotion at work. You've been there for a while. You've been a faithful employee. You've done a great job. You hear about a possible promotion coming up. You look around the rest of the staff. You, in your own mind, you're thinking, well, you know what? I think I'm in line for that promotion. In your head, you've kind of as good as got it. You're so excited about it. And then you go to work one day and find out that the boss actually gave it to one of your coworkers. So how do you feel right now? What are the feelings? What are the emotions? Well, I'm thinking anger, envy, and maybe you just blurt out something spontaneous and erratic, like, oh, there's no justice in the world, and you feel really, really angry. You see, they are not evil thoughts. All of those things are incredibly valid, and we need to validate our thoughts and emotions when they're happening. These moments are going to happen in our lives. For some of us, that might be this week, or it won't be long before these things happen, right? So don't deny them, acknowledge them. And then if you need to, if you can't process something in yourself, then go and chat with a good friend. Chat with a friend who's a safe place. And don't go and talk about it with lots of different people. Don't be that person. Just find one person, a good friend, a pastor, a connect group leader, someone that you trust, someone that's not going to try and fix everything, someone who's going to listen, ask good questions, and help you gain a healthy perspective. And don't be defined then by those emotions. The key is that in your mind, you say, yeah, I'm feeling all of these things, but I'm choosing not to act out on any of these emotions. And I believe that that's the crux of this amazing story. The Lord said to Cain, why are you angry? Why is your face downcast? If you do what is right, will you not be accepted? But if you do not do what is right, sin is crouching at the door. It desires to have you, but you must rule over it. It will become a crouching tiger. Now, I don't know where Cain lived. Maybe he was a caveman. Maybe he had some sort of primitive tent or hut or whatever. But the picture here is of a big cat crouching at the door. Sin is allegorized here like a tiger, and it's crouching at the door. What are you going to do about the tiger? Because God says about the tiger, it desires to have you. It wants to devour you, but you must rule over it. What are those feelings? What are those emotions? They desire to have you, but you got to learn to rule over them, because eventually those feelings will dissipate. It might take a few hours. It might take a few days. If it's really bad, it may take a few weeks for you to really work this through. But if you don't process them in a healthy way, the tiger will pounce. If you handle your disappointments in this way, you will have greater strength to overcome those temptations in the future. When we handle these things correctly, a spiritual strengthening happens on the inside. So that gives you some helpful and practical insight into the story of Cain and Abel. I was trying to find some pictures for this story, and I put one on the post for today's discussion, and it was of two white guys. In fact, all the pictures of Cain and Abel were two white guys, and I mean, it was just absolutely hilarious. I tried to find some that were realistic, but there was only one picture I could find with. Remember, like the early humans probably came from somewhere in Africa. They've traced it back. So it's likely that the early humans were dark-skinned. But Christianity's become so westernized that all the characters suddenly become white people, and they probably weren't. But this is the worst picture that I found. I want you to have a look at this for a moment. And what do we notice about that story? About that picture? So who's doing the killing? The black guy, right? Who's the victim here? The white guy. Isn't that fascinating? I just thought I'd show you that, and it just shows, how stereotypical we can become, even when it comes to the Bible. So I hope that really, really helps you with that story. It's an amazing story, the story of Cain and Abel. And I really encourage you to read the first 11 chapters of Genesis, and don't try and work it out as historical stories. Read them as what they're meant to be: allegory, metaphor, parables, stories that convey truth. And ask yourself, what is the truth that impacts me today in 2022 from this ancient story that was told and retold thousands and thousands of years ago? Let me go to the chat the chat feed here. There's lots of questions and comments. Lorraine says hi. Matt says a big problem is that there is a lack of caution from prophets about the whole issue of discerning whether God told me. Lots of comments there. Leviticus 17:11, that is why God rejected Cain's offering. Interesting. I don't know what Leviticus 17:11 says, Matt. Maybe you want to just put that in the chat feed so I don't have to look it up while I'm chatting with you guys. G'day to Frankie. Good to see you live, he says. Thanks, Frankie, for joining me. G'day to Tim Perry as well. Bless you, Tim. Are you in Bangkok at the moment? G'day to Chris and Tom. Thanks for joining me. Hi there to Katie, who says, hi there, one and all. James got a question about Fleetwood Mac. How did Fleetwood Mac make such beautiful music in the 70s when their lives were in such turmoil? Rumours album was a masterpiece. I totally agree with you. Isn't it amazing how sometimes the most incredible creativity comes out of the most awful moments? In fact, some of the most powerful songs have come out of the depths of pain and despair. There's something that happens in the depth of human emotion. And, you know, getting back to that story about Cain and Abel, when we process our emotions in the right way, in a healthy way, then God's able to bring something wonderful through the pain and through the suffering. So I don't know, James, but I know that they're still alive and well, and they're doing great, even in their 70s, doing really, really well. Ross says here, that's an interesting comment. Jordan Peterson got very emotional while talking about Jesus Christ in an online video. I'd be interested in your take. Peterson appears to be searching for faith and meaning to life. That's great, Ross. I don't know a lot about Jordan Peterson. I don't believe he's a Christian. Mate, if you would like to send me the link to that, I would love to watch it. And maybe we even watch some of it together on a Tuesday Night Live, and then I talk about it. But pray for Jordan Peterson that he will come to faith in Jesus Christ. Amen. Selena says, this parable reminds me of the parable Jesus told about the prodigal son, where the son who never left got upset by his father's reaction to the other son's return. Spot on. In fact, I'm actually teaching on one of Jesus' parables this weekend on Bayside Church Online, as well as in our in-person gathering. And it's a very similar story to that, a very similar story where people in the story get really ticked because of the amount of grace and kindness that the master, Jesus, is showing to other people. So great comment. Selena, another good comment from Selena here, says, also reminds me of an extreme case of sibling rivalry. How very, very true that is. Lots of comments here from Matt. Eric Chan says, Cain was not meant to settle. His punishment was to wander. Even in punishment, he rebelled against God. Interesting perspective, Eric. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure, but that's an interesting perspective. Thanks for sharing it. G'day, Grant, who says, great teaching. Zizi says, racism is very old. It is old. It's very sad, isn't it? Tal, my dear rabbi friend, says, Cain and Abel were most likely twins. Really? And yet the scriptures say that sometime later, Abel was born. I'm wondering, I mean, that could be correct if they're twins, but what I read in the story was that it was a process of time, not just minutes. But interesting perspective, Tal. Thank you for that. Tim says, yes, he is still in Bangkok. God bless you, mate. And thank you for joining me. I was just thinking about you during the week, actually. I'm glad you're doing okay. Diane, who asked that question about Cain and Abel, and thank you for the question, says, thank you, Rob. Much better understanding. We'll definitely seek out your, it's not blog number 11, it's podcast number 11 of Digging Deeper. And Tim says, I listened to Jordan Peterson, not sure what else he has to do for us to say he's a follower of Christ. He preaches Jesus more than most of us. Interesting perspective, Tim. Thank you. I can't say that I've actually listened a lot or watch much of Jordan Peterson, but I certainly have heard of him, and but I haven't checked him out enough to make an opinion either way. I look forward to watching the clip that Ross talks about. Hey, before we get into the next question, just want to mention to you something really exciting, and that's this weekend at Bayside Church is our 30th birthday. As a young single bloke, I was sent out by another church in 1992 with a small team of people, and we were sent out to pioneer a church in the Bayside part of Melbourne in a suburb called Cheltenham. And so that was the third Sunday of March, 1992. This Sunday is the third Sunday of March, 2022, which means that I have been, and of course, Christy, who came along a couple of years later, we got married in 1994. We have been pastoring Bayside Church for 3 decades, which we're very, very excited about. And this weekend, we'll have a bit of a celebration. So that will be online as well as in person. If you are coming in person, we're asking, if you wouldn't mind, please, could you register your intention to come? Because I've heard that there may be some food. I believe we've got birthday cake, and also there's a barbecue afterwards. So if you could please register, and if you are able to come this weekend, I'd absolutely love to see you come and join us and celebrate with us 3 decades. And of course, lots of good things still to come. I find myself still bubbling with the same amount of energy and zeal and enthusiasm for Jesus and his church as I was 30 years ago, if not more so. And so I'm very excited for our next few years together. After the flood, this is the next question. After the flood, did God create more people, or did Noah's family reproduce amongst themselves? Great question, but it actually doesn't matter. Although, why would there be different rules for populating the planet, people and animals, after the flood? The rules before were be fruitful and multiply, and so the same rules would kick into place. The number one commandment, by the way, in the Hebrew Bible, and this is from a Jewish perspective, was to have more generations. And so, particularly amongst primitive people, they were in tribes. The tribes were often warring with one another. So it was very important that people got married and produced as many children for the tribes as they possibly could. So be fruitful and multiply and fill the earth was the most important commandment, the number one commandment to Jewish people. As I've already noted, pre-Abram accounts in Genesis amongst the Jews are considered to be allegorical or metaphorical stories. And so this story, the story of the flood and after the flood, is part of that as well, because it's in Genesis chapters 1 to 11. And so I've already mentioned this. These are tribal stories. They're thousands of years old. They've been told and retold before eventually being written down. Just because the stories in Genesis 1 to 11 are allegories, it doesn't mean that they aren't based on at least a level of fact. So a lot of these stories would be, there'd be things happening in the world, and then stories would be told about the observations of the things that happened in the world from the perspective of ancient people who believed the world was flat, it was a disc, you'd fall off the edge if you went out too far. Heaven was up, that's where God was. The grave was down, that's where you went when you died. That was the perspective of ancient people, and that there were many gods who had to be appeased in lots of different ways. So let me give you an example of this. If there was a massive flood, to them, the whole world was flooded. That was their perspective. That was their world. They didn't have the understanding of the globe of the earth that we have today. But when a flood happened, that was their entire world flooding. So they wrote that story, rather they told that story that was eventually written down as if the whole world had flooded, because that was their perspective. And then they would tell stories, parables, from their experience. It's like the people in northern New South Wales and Queensland over the last few weeks. As we know, there's been a dreadful amount of rain that's led to awful flooding in southern Queensland, southeast Queensland, and the northern part of New South Wales. For those people, their whole world has been affected. And you listen to some of the people on the news telling their stories. I've lost everything. My whole world has been lost. My whole life has been changed. That's their perspective. And this is their story, which needs to be told and validated and learned from. So our questions here need to be something like this. What question is the flood story addressing? What problem is it supposed to be fixing? Now, the answer to those questions will be different at different times. For ancient people, it may have been one answer. For us today, in 2022 and beyond, our answer to that question, what would the story be about for us? I think, well, what it says to me is climate change, because the story to me is a warning, and the warning is there for us all around the world. I mean, I've just mentioned the floods in Queensland, New South Wales. Those floods, worse than any other floods that have ever happened in that part of the world. And of course, those communities have experienced floods over and over again, but nothing like this. And they're increasing in intensity, and they're increasing in regularity. And so God is giving us signs because we have eyes to see and a brain to think, so that we can work out what's happening around us in the world. And so when I read that story, that's what I'm getting in 2022 from the flood story. Is God to blame for the floods and the fires and the like? The answer to that question is no. What are people doing to make it worse? What are people doing to make it better? The fact of the climate being impacted by the burning of fossil fuels was first flagged in 1896. A few decades later, it was quantified and graphed by a guy called Guy Callender. And he put it all together, and he was able to show the impact that human beings were having on the atmosphere, the climate, and the environment since the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, which is when we started burning fossil fuels en masse. So, yep, we started hearing about climate change back in the 90s. And I've got to tell you, back in the 90s, I just thought, rolled my eyes a bit. So it sounds like a bit of a lefty greeny sort of thing, and didn't give it another thought. But it's taken a few years for me to really think, oh my goodness, as you start looking around the world and you start seeing there's stuff going on, and it's likely that we're causing this. And then we start hearing the bulk of scientists saying we need to change tack now before it's too late, before the world floods. What can we do to make it better? So from the story, yeah, it's time to build an ark. There's a warning. And I'm not saying we need to go out and build literal boats, because we're all going to get flooded and we need to float. But what can we do to make the world better right now? How can I live? How can my family live in a way that we have less and less impact on the environment if we all do our part? How can we lobby and encourage our local members, our politicians, state and federal, to be more mindful of the climate, and to realize that it is a very, very serious issue? Because the time when there's still time to rectify the damage is now. It was the same back in the flood story. It tells us there that while Noah built the ark, he was warning people. So it's time to change. It's time to change. Change now. There's a flood coming. Change now. We're the same. What are we going to change now before the flood comes? The world will never recover. Once the ark door was closed in the story, the flood came, It was too late then. And what I get from that story today is that the world, we will get to a point, if we don't address these things, that the world will get to a stage where the damage is done and the world will not recover. And so that's the beauty of the sacred text. It's not working out who gave birth to who and how the world was repopulated. It's actually, what does this ancient story say to my life today? I've shared with you what I get from that story. As you read through that, what is God saying to you? What is your OMG moment from reading the story of the flood? I hope that helps you. Let me go and check the chat feed once again. Matt says, happy 30th birthday, Bayside, and congrats, Rob. Thanks so much, Matt. Really appreciate that, mate. Selena says, happy 30th birthday, Bayside. Church can't wait to eat cake and celebrate. Bring it on. Absolutely. Grant says, very much looking forward to Sunday. Glad you're coming, mate. Thank you, Ross. He's given me the link there, and that will be there for all of you too in the chat feed for the Jordan Peterson clip. I really look forward to watching that. Zizi says, your enthusiasm shows in your teaching. That's why we are all here. That's lovely, Zizi. Thank you so much. Greta says, thank you. Good evening to you, Greta. God bless you. Matt says, it's interesting to compare with the Epic of Gilgamesh and the flood story. What we're going to understand is that there actually are lots and lots of ancient flood stories. So the likelihood is that there was a massive flood, or maybe even several floods in the Middle Eastern area where a lot of these stories originated. And so there are multiple flood stories, as there are multiple creation stories as well. And so we have two of those creation stories recorded in our Bible. In Genesis chapter 1, there is one creation story. And in Genesis chapter 2, there is a completely different creation story. Does it mean that God created in two different ways? No. It means they're two different parables expressing different perspectives and different truths. They're not meant to be taken literally. And so the Epic of Gilgamesh, tells a very similar story. Not sure if it's the same origin, but certainly would come out of the same part of the world, and so would have an Eastern Hebrew Jewish / non-Western perspective to it. Matt says, we were more concerned about the hole in the ozone layer back then. We were. I remember getting very sunburnt when I first moved to Melbourne in the late 80s, and didn't realize how strong the sun was here because of the hole in the ozone layer. And that's a great point, because the hole in the ozone layer, hasn't that repaired itself? When we start to care for the earth, God's world is incredibly resilient. We just want to get to the point where, we don't want to get to the point of no return because that would be awful. And we're being warned that we're not far off, so we really need to get serious about this now. We really need to do that. 6 minutes to 9 is the time. I don't have the time left to get back into the next question. So, Mark, I'm sorry about that. I'll put that into next Tuesday evening. The question is, when Jesus told Pontius Pilate, you would have no power over me if it weren't given to you from above, is he saying that God chooses people to be in powerful leadership positions, people like Vladimir Putin? And that's actually a really, really good question. And I want to give it the time necessary to explore that, because Christians over the decades have taken that to mean what you're saying there, that God is actually responsible for putting people like Putin and Hitler into authority, and therefore we should submit to their authority. There was a big part of Germany. Of course, Germany was a Christian nation, probably still largely is, I don't know. But back in the 30s, it was about 90% Protestant and maybe about 9% Catholic. It was 1% Jewish. But of course, Hitler went for the Jews. And the Christians, by and large, said nothing about it, and they were complicit. And a big part of it was that Christian preachers were saying, well, the Bible says there's no authority except that which God institutes. And so God has instituted the authority of Hitler, and we've got to follow that. We've got to submit to that, which is just absolutely dead wrong. And it would be the same with Putin. And so, as I say, I'll go into detail on that next week, Mark. And the other question I'll touch on next week as well that we haven't got to tonight, and that is, why do we say in Jesus' name before we say amen? Is it because Jesus said that whatever you ask in my name, it will be given to you, or is there a deeper meaning to it? It's a really, really good question, and I'll answer that for you next Tuesday night. I saw this really, really talking about Putin and the awful invasion of Ukraine at the moment, but I was reading BBC News this morning on the BBC News app, and it told the story and actually showed the picture. I put it, I think, on my Facebook story today, so you can go and check it out. But someone snuck into a TV studio in Russia and had a big banner, and they got into the TV studio while the newsreader was reading the news and stood behind them with this sign that says in Russian, "They're all lying to you." I mean, that's gutsy, isn't it? And yet someone's standing up there because God didn't put Putin in authority in Russia. The guy is a terrorist, and he's doing awful, awful things. I mean, Donald Trump might think that he's a genius, but Donald Trump and I very, very rarely see eye to eye anyway. And what Putin is doing to his own people and what Putin is doing to the people of Ukraine at the moment is awful. And my prayers have been very much along the line of rescuing the Russians and rescuing the people of Ukraine from that man. A couple of things just to finish off, and that is next Monday and Tuesday night, we have Step to God and Step to Church on Zoom. So if you would like to do either of those, Step to God is the first step in our discipleship pathway. Step to Church is the second step. You have to do Step to God first, and if you've already done Step to God, then you can do Step to Church. So you can register for those via the Bayside Church website. You go to baysidechurch.com.au and you can register for those. Of course, they're great courses to do, but if you've already done them or if you can't do them this time, of course, please do feel free to join me for Tuesday Night Live. Mark, you're very gracious, mate. He says, no problem at all, waiting for another week to get the answer to his question. Selena says, interesting fact, Jehovah's Witnesses were also put into concentration camps before they refused to fight for Hitler. Oh, because, yes, they were. In fact, the Nazis killed about 11 million people. So there were 6 million Jews, and we often focus on that, and rightly so, importantly so, but there were 5 million other people, and it included Jehovah's Witnesses, gay people, gypsies, Christian pastors particularly, who did not teach that his congregation were to submit to Hitler, and so on. So 6 million Jews, 5 million other people, including the Jehovah's Witnesses. Like the tank man in China years ago, Ross, absolutely. I think that image will be indelibly planted in my mind, that amazing guy standing there in front of the tank in Tiananmen Square. Absolutely amazing. Amazing. We need to stand up to the dictators of this world, and praise God, we live in a country that is a democracy. One of the things that saddened me during the pandemic was hearing people bag out on our premier in such a disrespectful way, and even Christian people doing that. I don't see in Scripture where we should be disrespectful of our leaders in our country. Doesn't mean that we always like them. Doesn't mean that we always have to agree with them, but we do have to pray for them. And I think that's really, really important that we pray for our leaders, and thank God that we get to live in a country that is as safe as Australia. 9 o'clock it is. Been wonderful to hang out with you for the last hour. Thank you so much for joining me. Have a wonderful week, and I look forward to seeing you either online or in person this weekend for Bayside Church's 30th birthday. Good night. God bless you.